Welcome to episode 12 of Breaking, Building, and Belonging. It's a memoir-driven leadership podcast that basically putting out there to get some feedback on a book that I'm in the process of writing that is part memoir, part leadership lesson. I'm actually thinking about publishing two books in the middle of 2025. One that would be this combination of memoir and leadership lessons, and the other that might be just more like a traditional memoir of stories. And when I say a memoir, it's really more character portraits of different characters in my life. And essentially what I've done is try to capture some of these folks so that I could share them with you all in these little vignettes. And so what you do if you listen to any of the previous episodes is catch a few of those. We essentially share a character portrait of someone from my life, and then we share some life lessons in the next chapter called Reflections on Reality. And then after that, I do what's called a Go Deeper episode, where I'll kind of take us a little bit deeper into the lessons that are learned. Just to explore additional areas where someone might be able to relate. And I'm hoping that you can. I'm hoping you can get something out of this and find some value in it. This episode is going to be pretty much a straight up reading of Panic's Pariahs and Professors, which is the chapter on my grandmother, Graham. She was a huge presence in my life, and I still can vividly remember her. She had an amazing way about her, and I'm attempting to capture some of that in this story. So I open it up with an interesting contrast that Sebastian Maniscalco observed about Italians. It says, "Italians are fantastic people, really. They can work you over in an alley while singing an opera." And so I'm hoping that you see some of that same kind of dichotomy with Graham. As I walked into the kitchen in my bathrobe, I looked at Graham, a cigarette dangling from her mouth, sopping up egg with the rye toast my peepop lovingly prepared for her. "Look, Dom, the professor's awake." She usually chuckled with a startling harumph at things like this. Graham liked to poke fun at me for holding the future promise of a well-read man of letters in the same skinny, skeletal body of a world-class dumbass. I was not her only target, nor was any of it hurled at me with anything but the deepest love and sympathy. The woman would have killed for me, for any of us. Graham lavished the kind of love and attention on me that only the firstborn grandson of a New York Italian-American family can understand. Graham was my quintessentially Sicilian-American grandmother, Josephine Margalotti. As she drank her bottomless cups of coffee, she continued chain-smoking her Marlboro 100 and lodged a fervent complaint with Peepop in Brooklyn Italianese. With her unoccupied hand, she gestured across our small apartment to the opposite window, where our jalopies were waiting in their first-come, first-served parking spaces, just outside. Depending on when this happened, you might have seen a broken-down Nissan pickup, an evergreen Mustang with a pinstripe and bent axles, or a yellow Gran Torino that looked more like a boat than a sedan. As she waggled her hand at them, her tirade roughly translated into something like this: "Stunad, the Bastiano's changing his Earl next to my beautiful car, on my sidewalk, Vacavangul." This Stunad in question was rarely obvious. Every passerby, neighbor, family member, or store clerk was fair game. There were no simulated attempts at delicacy to protect the kids' ears or cries of earmuffs a la Will Ferrell's Old School. This particular mechanic outside had something in common with the most famous mechanic in our lives, though, my estranged father. Did bastardo sound more like Bastiano or something close to our untrained ears? I later learned she and my peepop were a bit more fond of their son-in-law than I was initially led to believe by listening to years of complaints about him. Graham's time on Earth predated Dateline, but she had a knack for weaving intricate tales filled with intrigue about him and what he was up to now when I was in elementary school and I was constantly asking about him. She had similar yarns to spin about our neighbors, or the woman or the man she saw in the River Terrace Apartments laundry room when I lived with her as a teen. She made most of her observations without getting to know anyone, simply by peering out the homemade lace curtains of her window, which was neither set on a terrace nor overlooking the nearby intercoastal waterway we called a river. I now urge any of you who want to remember Mike Myers' Linda Richmond Coffee Talk character to discuss. I'll wait. Like an Italian Gladys Kravitz, the quintessential 1970s nosy neighbor character from TV's Bewitched, Graham had this magical way of code switching as she left the confines of her apartment and greeted said semi-anonymous residents with a Marlboro hanging from her lip, laundry basket in hand. Graham's warm, kind smile, welcome greetings, and faux meek laugh could rival any Southern lady blessing someone's heart on the apartment complex sidewalk. This transplanted Southern lady spent the second half of her life on the Space Coast of Florida, with the garlic of Southern Italy running through her veins while she watched the palm trees sway in the breeze. The New York to Florida migration she executed was not precisely a retirement from the world of work, as it was a work-for-pay stoppage in deference to a life of caring for everyone around her. It was not an "I'm going to stay home and take care of the kids" choice. Her youngest child was nearly a high school graduate when we moved to Florida. Her child-rearing days were supposed to end, but that would prove to be a pipe dream, although if anyone deserved some respite, it was my Graham. Rather than rest, she rescued my triplet sisters and me, time and again, whether it was with a meal, a roof over our head, or to protect us from our mother's erratic temper and lifestyle. Graham worked as a seamstress from a young age in what I would now characterize distinctly as sweatshops. I remember visiting her once or twice, looking up into a cloud of all too familiar smoke, listening to the rev of what sounded like 1,000 sewing machines, watching the pedals of the women undulate, the bobbin winders sacrificing their thread at an unyielding pace. Colors flew through the air and across the sewing decks as the material squeezed between the plates and the sewing feet in torrents of fabric. When she moved to Florida, she gave up that glamorous life and entered the restaurant business with my grandfather, aka Dom or Peepop, and her brother Rocky. That did not work out as planned when the family fell out, ending with the curse words mentioned above and other epithets flying in an altogether different, colorful torrent. The hands and words flew, bilingually, equally cast about by similarly colorful characters in what could have been a scene from an Italian-American sitcom farce like Everybody Loves Raymond, but that's a little too tame of a reference. If it were not disturbingly real life, in the aftermath, Peepop and Graham tried to start and run the restaurant independently. However, they lacked the financial support and knowledge of the East Coast of Florida dining community to make their fledgling hero, aka sub, shop work. This failure to launch wasn't her first setback. Graham was a woman called upon to be tough and resourceful her whole life. She began by working on an assortment of assignments delegated by Nina, her mother, a seamstress, and a serial entrepreneur herself. My great-grandparents, Frank, Papa, and Josephine, Nina Margalotti, yes, they had the same name, were bona fide immigrants of the Ellis Island variety. And no, that's not a typo. My grandmother and my great-grandmother had Not only that same name, but they shared a birthday. My papa was a gifted stonemason who spent time in the Italian cavalry in World War I. My Nina sewed and broke her body working in her various businesses. Nina had side hustles well before they were all the rage. Nina and Papa rose to live a middle-class lifestyle on Long Island before she passed away. Papa moved to Florida with Uncle Rocky shortly after Nina died. We followed him a couple of years later. One significant opportunity for my Gram to display her resourcefulness came as we took the Greyhound bus from Long Island. We reached Jacksonville. We were hungry. The we was all of us: Gram, Peepop, my Aunt Margaret, my mom, my 6-year-old triplet sisters, and 9-year-old me. The challenge was no adult had any cash in their pockets, wallets, purses, or bank accounts. You may be wondering what our plan was. Well, it was to look to Great Gram's dad, Papa, for cash, and her brother, Uncle Rocky, for shelter, until we got on our feet. Undaunted in the 3 hours before our reunion with Papa and his money, my grandmother broke out a silver dollar necklace and sacrificed the contents to buy a hot dog for us to share. Us may be a bit of a stretch, as it was primarily we younger kids who benefited from the exchange. It felt like an authentic loaves and fishes moments as we entered the promised land of the Sunshine State. And I should probably tell you another detail that I haven't threaded into the book yet about that silver dollar necklace. It was one of many heirlooms passed down to her from Nina, her mother. And that woman was incredibly important to my grandmother. She was sort of the center of her world. And when she died, something died in my grandma. And despite that inspiring moment with the fishes and loaves and the silver dollar, the fish and bread would take some time to appear on our collective plates in little more than scraps down there in Florida. Neither the cash nor the relationship with Papa or Uncle Rocky withstood our incursion on their homes and their lives in Florida. As I mentioned, within a year, the restaurant we were forced to open on our own floundered. Peepop went to work as a cook in someone else's restaurant by the time it was all over. Now, I mentioned earlier that my grandmother was gorgeous. If I do not correct that perception, my description might dissuade you from that idea, leaving you perplexed. She was lovely as a young lady, and even into her older years before cancer took hold. She was tall and statuesque for a southern Italian woman, with thick, gorgeous black locks and long legs. She would often self-promote as beautiful. As life, poverty, coffee, and cigarettes wore on, her face gained the wrinkles and texture of a grizzled smoker, and her hair turned a brittle silver. However, she battled that gray with boxes of Clairol, leaving behind pitch black and rusty auburn-dyed sinks in apartments for decades. Beneath those locks lay the spunky raven-haired siren who knocked my Peepop off his feet and made him fall for her in a way that Aphrodite would admire. He finally joined her in heaven after languishing until the age of 101, pining for her for 3 decades. His too long anticipated reunion with his gorgeous trickster of a bride brought us a joy we cannot easily describe with mere words. Along with that beauty, Gram was a woman of paralyzing anxiety and sacrificial courage rolled into one frenetic package. She would often exclaim, "I'm afraid." She feared things many of us might find innocuous. Things like driving at night, swimming, virtually any body of water, and boats. You see, she watched someone drown as a young child and never learned to swim. She watched one of her sisters die in a fire. She imbued that fear and generalized anxiety into all of us. And despite that soaking, my aunts and I learned how to swim as teenagers or adults. My sister struggled with it too, and I'm not sure my mother ever acquired the skill. The flip side of this silver dollar dame was that she was also brave. She would fight for her family. She would take on nearly anyone in a verbal or, if necessary, physical way, which threatened her loved ones. Anybody that threatened her loved ones, she'd take them on. She was also a risk taker of a whole nother level. She would often sneak over the back of the public supermarket and steal food from their dumpster for us. Once, she spent a couple of nights in jail for writing bad checks to keep our combined households afloat. Now, Graham did not limit her ingenuity to the world of crime. She made our clothes when I needed a suit for my Holy Communion, or my sisters needed a dress for a wedding or some similar ritual. I will never forget the time we searched all over multiple towns for a white pair of pants to no avail, only to have her shout, "Oh well, I'll make him some pants out of my white tablecloth." The next time you hear about people giving food out of their mouths or the roof over their heads for their families, I'd like you to think of Graham. She let my mom, sisters, and I live with her at various times in our turbulent lives. Sometimes together, sometimes apart. She worked to manage the more chaotic elements of our lives as much as possible. She and Peepop often subsidized our lives as the food stamps ran out exceedingly earlier and earlier in the month. And when we were not living with them, if we or they had a car or gas, we would go to their house on Sundays to eat a family meal together. Sunday meals usually involve gravy, aka spaghetti sauce, and pasta. Interestingly, she was not the cook in the family. My Peepop was. So I would help him cook while she worked with the girls on some home project she was creating. She made many of her own furniture coverings and window treatments and frequently moved the furniture around. And I have the broken toes to prove it from my late shift arrivals after my job at McDonald's. Over the years, she was the rock in our clan. She helped me get my first job and car, and she helped me contact my estranged father and family, and she did much of the same for many of us. She would cut my hair when we had no money or transportation for a haircut. I can still hear the sickly slice crunch of my bangs as the hair fell past my eyes, leaving me with a crooked bowl cut, born of the thick metal seamstress quality shears that Graham had not sharpened since my sisters were born. Now, none of this was the idyllic family dynamic you see whitewashed and plastered across big or small screens in our culture. But Grandma taught us something more important than any of those illusions could. She taught me to persevere. I watched her manage her way through untenable situations to the other side repeatedly. A more accurate word than repeatedly would likely be daily. As I write about untenable pressures, it evokes the feeling one gets when holding a pawn ticket, or at least the emotion of a child when he looks up and watches his loved one exchange a cherished heirloom for one. Long before my sometimes way too administrative career in human resources, I became with the triplicate paperwork of the pawnbroker. These gents likes to use ticket pads for their blood oaths. Their white, yellow, and pink numbered receipts with carbon paper strategically set between them to catch the scribbled terms of agreements with little to no chance of being fulfilled by one of the parties. One of the things Nina, Graham's mom, left us from her dalliance with 1970s middle-class affluence was her jewelry. By the time I was in high school, that jewelry had all gone to the pawnbroker. The pawn shop was within walking distance of one of our many rental homes. During middle school, we grew to know our regular pawn shop broker so well that he would warmly greet us when he saw us in the street or at the mall. On payday, I remember how Graham would rush out to spend precious parts of my grandfather's just over minimum wage paycheck. This ritual of keeping up interest payments on multiple cherished rings, sentimental bracelets, and old world brooches persisted until the clock burned through so much cash that the items each in turn had to be let go. Some fights were more courageous and hard fought than others. Nevertheless, every bauble was sacrificed for non-renewable resources, electricity, food, or gas money. Might those trinkets still be out there somewhere? More likely they were melted down for their gold when the prices were high, or broken and discarded long since the days of our possession. After all, they were just things. But if you knew my Gram, you knew that the one thing she loved more than anything, save perhaps my Peepop, was her mother. She mourned her decades after her passing, clutching her breast when the feelings of loss would overwhelm her, and moaning for her lost madre. Mamma mia, madre, mamma mangia. Mom, I miss you. I often felt those charms were like little pieces of Nina she struggled to hang on to, even as she forced herself to ransom them one by one for the benefit of her living loved ones. In that way and a million other ways, she taught me how to prioritize family and what service leadership was all about before I had any of the words for that. When I was 16, I moved in with my grandparents and we cared for one another. Hence the bleary-eyed bathrobe and breakfast scene I opened with. I gave them very little money, maybe a little bit here and there, and they gave me a roof over my head while I worked and wasted time with my friends. It was a lopsided proposition where I felt good because I paid a cable bill here and there or bought some groceries, and maybe I remedied an occasional overdue electric account. I never did any of the cooking or laundry. I never cleaned a toilet. They even gave me the more enormous bedroom in a tiny 2-bedroom apartment. I was the most spoiled poor kid on the planet. Now, the real workhorse of the family was Peepop. He kept the lights on while we all tried to figure out what to do with ourselves. He set the standard for the work ethic and never casually quit, even under the most pathetic conditions. In contrast, at 16, I dropped out of high school, and in one of my seriously stunad moments, I almost quit my job at McDonald's. I stormed home in anger over some overblown drama I mostly made up in my head. But Gram, she didn't let that stand. She made me return to work and beg for reinstatement as the fry guy. I worked at McDonald's for years after that and rose in the ranks quickly, but that may never have happened had she and Peepop not set the standard and let me off the hook at that critical moment. She did not live to see this professor go back to school and become the first one in our family to graduate from college summa cum laude or obtain a master's degree. If she saw where I live now and the beautiful family I have been blessed with, I'm sure she would, in her way, be happy for me. Although she was never overly impressed by degrees, houses, fancy cars, or careers. So she might be a little skeptical of my non-denominational faith and wonder why she sewed that tablecloth that I could, wear for my communion and how I could give up my Catholic faith. She might see my struggle with common sense that continues despite my academic accomplishments and book-born learnings. I could picture her hanging out with my wife and shaking their heads at me as she teaches her how to say stunad with the proper emphasis and the drawn-out D at the end. Nikki does more than a fair job of keeping me straight, but I wish my wife could have learned it from the best directly. I sometimes daydream of an alternate timeline where she is here for my younger family and friends to get to know and love her, because she was indeed one of a kind, and for every bit of chit my Peepop taught me, more on that in an upcoming chapter, she prepared this quote-unquote professor to be full of grit. Thank you for joining me for episode 12 of Breaking, Building, and Belonging. Next, we're going to do a reflections on reality from Panics, Pariahs, and Professors, and what I learned from my Graham. Thank you for joining. I hope that you'll continue to tune in, subscribe, and please share this with anybody you think could find of value. I also look forward to any comments or ideas you have for how I can improve this book. Thank you so much.